Thank you. Good morning and Assalamu alaikum. Let me get straight into the subject. This is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to start by looking at two fundamentally different ways of thinking and talking about religion. And unless you're very clear at all times which of these two ways of thinking you're applying, you can very easily end up having a dialogue of the deaf because you're talking past each other. I'm going to look briefly at the history of Christianity and Islam, and then I'm going to go straight into the subject of comparing them and how, first of all, how do you compare different religions, and then look at specifically at Christianity and Islam and see where they agree and where they disagree. And finally, I've got lots of really interesting reading material for you. And I do recommend getting some of these books and reading them because some of them are actually quite gripping. So first of all, me. I was born in Pakistan, but I've lived in the UK since 1952. And I actually know Ashton Underline moderately well, but from a long time ago, because in the 1970s, long before you were born, I spent 18 months working on Stamford Street training as a chartered accountant. And these are some of the organizations that I belong to. And the most important thing on this slide isn't my picture, it's the bit in red at the bottom, my website, where there is a lot of written material and previous presentations. And if the technology works today, my recording of today's presentation will end up on the website as well. So, different ways of thinking about religion. There are fundamentally two of them. There's the perspective of the religious believer. And I am one of these. I'm a Muslim. We believe that God exists, that He can do anything. Sometimes He reveals the future, He communicates with mankind. That is one way of thinking about religion. And the Pope, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Imams would all share that perspective. But there's also a very different way of thinking about religion. And that is the academic way, where you want to study a religion and you want to engage in a dialogue that does not depend on whether you believe the religion is true or false. And from an academic's perspective, they're looking at how humans think about an idea of God. Because if you have something about God in your head, what is it that how do you visualize that? Where does that idea come from? How do you relate to it? By definition, academics are not interested in divine intervention. If you find a really well-written religious text that predicts the future, the one thing the academic knows is that that text was written after the event that it claims to prophesy. And obviously miracles never happened. Every religious text there is in the world was written by some human being, normally by recycling somebody else's religious text, and they will study how one text and another text overlap, differ, etc. But the idea of divine authorship is simply out of scope. And that applies regardless of whether the academic is an atheist, a Christian, or a Muslim. You have to engage in this common agreement about how you can speak if you're going to engage in academic dialogue and discussion. And that sometimes frustrates and annoys certain people. There was an expert on Islam who got very upset when trying to discuss the history of the Quran with academics because they simply refused to think about the subject the way that he wanted to think about it, which was the Quran as divine revelation. Because to an academic, divine revelation is simply out of scope. It's not relevant. And most of today, I will be talking from the perspective of an academic, even though I personally am a religious believer. So let's look at the history. We're talking about Christianity and Islam today, but you cannot understand either religion without first starting with Judaism. Because when you look at it objectively, it's blindingly obvious that both Christianity and Islam derive from Judaism. And Islam, being the youngest of these three religions, basically derives from both. Some from Judaism directly, and some from Judaism as influenced by Christianity. And it helps to look at where Islam came from. This is the Middle East at the time of that the Prophet was alive. And I put on Jerusalem, I put on a yellow dot for Mecca and Medina, because they're so close to each other that it's fine to just have one yellow dot. And the whole area had very significant Christian presence, because Christianity had been around now for basically 600 years. But it's also important to understand that there was a very large Jewish presence. Jews have been in the Middle East since time immemorial, not just in Palestine, but in what we now call Iraq, and in particular in what we now call the Yemen. And in fact, in the 500s, there was actually a Jewish kingdom in the Yemen that used to fight wars against Christian Ethiopia. So the question of how you compare religions. And there's an article you can find from the homepage of my website called Triangulating the Abrahamic Faiths. And it's my attempt to assess the relative closeness of all three of these religions. And this triangle tells you in a picture how I feel about them. Namely that Islam and Judaism are very close to each other. Christianity is extremely different from both, but slightly closer to Islam than it is to Judaism. And I'll explain that today's talk is not about the three religions, it's about Christianity and Islam, but I might mention in passing or in the question and answer session why I think Christianity is closer to Islam. And it comes down to Jesus. So one way of measuring the closeness of religions is just to look at their religious texts. And if any Christian ever shows you a Bible, a complete Bible, you can guarantee that they've got all the Jewish scriptures there also, because of course the Old Testament is the Holy Scriptures as far as Jews are concerned. And there is no overlap at all directly in terms of the text. Not the stories, not the content, but no part of the Quran will say this bit is Matthew. You wouldn't. The idea of taking a whole section of somebody else's religious text and including your own doesn't work that way. Whereas for Christianity accepts that Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, etc., are an integral part of the Bible. When we look at the question of prophets, in blue I've got some of the prophets mentioned in the Old Testament. And Christianity, the New Testament, just adds one, namely Jesus. And whether you think of Jesus as a prophet or think of Jesus as somebody different, that is out of scope on this particular slide. You just add on Jesus. And again, when you look at Islam, Islam is a bit different. It keeps and mentions some of the Jewish prophets, gives a lot of coverage to Jesus, never mentions some of the other Jewish prophets like Malachi, Obadiah, etc. But then there are other prophets that, of course, do not get mentioned at all in the Old and New Testaments. So if you take this quantitative, numerical approach, you would end up concluding that Christianity and Judaism are very similar and Islam's very different. But actually, when you start looking at what people believe, it's quite different. And I'm now going to leave Judaism entirely to one side and just focus on Christianity and Islam. And when you get down to the essence, religious belief is not about how many times a day do you pray, or do you pray by looking towards Jerusalem or looking towards Mecca. It's about much more fundamental things. First of all, Christianity and Islam have got a lot in common. They both believe in the existence of God. And they believe that God communicates to mankind. There are an enormous number of prophets who appear both in the Quran and in the Bible. Both religions believe in the existence of angels, heaven and hell, and something that many non-Muslims are still unaware of, despite the fact that Islam is now the second largest religion in this country with millions of followers. There are still many non-Muslims who don't realize that Muslims believe in the virgin birth. There's a whole chapter of the Quran about Mary, and the story of the virgin birth is all there. And one of the things that I personally speculate about, I don't have any data, but basically all Muslims, if they're Muslims, believe in the virgin birth. There are more and more Christians these days who actually don't believe that the virgin birth literally happened. And I think eventually there will be a crossover point where there are actually more Muslims in the world who believe in the virgin birth than there are Christians in the world who believe in the virgin birth. Don't think we've got there yet, but it's coming simply because there are so many Christians who actually don't believe in the literal story of the virgin birth. So, more interestingly than where they overlap and agree is where they differ. And I picked a few really important key areas. And the first thing, of course, is when you're going to talk about Christianity, whose idea of Christianity are you going to take? Because there are an enormous number of Christian churches and denominations, and when you get down to the details, they say and believe different things. Well, the approach that I took was a very simple one. That by far and away the largest Christian church is the Roman Catholic Church, and secondly, they've got a really good website where they set out in writing, in English, what the Vatican believes, what the Pope believes, the official doctrinal position of the Roman Catholic Church. So everything I say about Christianity comes from the Roman Catholic Church. And for Islam, I've basically got quotes from the Quran, and these are totally mainstream, standard Muslim views, exactly the same whether you're Sunni or Shia. So, and they differ about things that really, really matter. The nature of Jesus. I said earlier, the big difference between Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, if you're looking at the three, is that as far as Judaism is concerned, they're not interested in Jesus. He doesn't really get a mention in official Judaism at all. He's mentioned by name 2 or 3 times in the Talmud, which is Jewish sort of scholarship from the rabbis, but basically, for Judaism, Jesus was just a Jew who's caused them a lot of problems. But Christianity and Islam both believe in the virgin birth, but they still have fundamental disagreements about the nature of Jesus. How do you get into heaven? It can't be a more important question in any religion if you believe in heaven or hell. They disagree. They disagree about the crucifixion, and something which is very important to me because I like to think about the world not just from my own personal religious perspective, the question of religious exclusivity. In other words, is your way the only real, true way or not? And they differ on that as well, as we'll see. So, what does Christianity have to say about Jesus? Here it is from the Vatican website. I'm not going to read it out word for word. But the key point is that in Christianity, Jesus is divine. That's where the Trinity comes from, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. The Muslim perspective, as set out in the Quran, the Word of God, is completely different. The Quran actually has Jesus being asked by God, did you ever claim to be divine? And he says, no, I would never claim that. Fundamentally, as far as Muslims are concerned, yes, Jesus had a virgin birth and I didn't, But apart from that, there isn't the slightest bit of theological difference between me and Jesus. Both of us are simply human beings, men. How do you get to heaven? Fundamentally, in Christianity, what gets you into heaven is believing and accepting that Jesus died on the cross for you, and by his dying washed away your sins. That is the essence of it. It doesn't mean that Christianity doesn't want you to be a good person, to behave well rather than behaving badly, but it's not behaving well that saves you. It is the sacrifice of Jesus. Islam is completely different. Basically, God tells you how to live, you then live your life, and on the day of judgment, he divides the sheep from the goats. Did you live well? Did you do your best? Are you going to pass whatever grade God decides to set for you, or are you going to fail? It's down to you. And I have one Quran quote here, which I particularly like. It's often summarized with the phrase that no soul will ever bear the burden of another. It's entirely down to you. Nobody else's good deeds or bad deeds make the slightest difference to how God will judge you. God will judge you by exactly what you do and how you behave. The crucifixion. I'm not going to bother saying what the Christianity says about the crucifixion. Everybody knows it, that Jesus was crucified and then raised from the dead. That is the Christian doctrine. The Quran says that people did not crucify Jesus, they only thought that they did. And as to what actually happened, don't ask me, I can't give you a detailed explanation. There's lots of alternative Muslim speculation about it, but the Quran is quite categorical about Jesus not actually being crucified. Religious exclusivism. There's a fundamental doctrine in Christianity, especially, as I said, here in the Catholic Church, which they often don't talk about because it doesn't sound very nice in reality, which is that you cannot be saved outside the church. Now, there is one get out if you read this text here. If you were living on a Pacific island and no Christian had ever reached you, no missionary had ever reached you, you never even knew that Jesus existed, then clearly it would be wrong of God to punish you for not being a Christian. But if you know about Jesus, you've had an opportunity to learn about Christianity and accept Jesus, and you don't, that's it. There is no salvation outside the church. And some Muslims talk about Islam the same way, but they're wrong. You will get these stalls outside train stations. I walked past one in London a few days ago, giving you free copies of the Quran. And if you ask the people there, they'll basically tell you either you're a Muslim or you won't go to heaven. That's it. It's not true. This is actually my favorite verse of the Quran, verse 62 of the second surah. And it's quite categorical. The people being talked about who have attained to faith, they're Muslims. But it's not just Muslims who have a place in heaven. Jews, Christians, and Sabaeans, they're a sort of lost people. You won't find any Sabaeans today. Provided they behave well and do the right thing, they have their place in heaven also. So Islam is a non-exclusive religion, unlike the Roman Catholic Church. So I promise you some reading material. First of all, the Bible. I read the Bible from cover to cover, from the first verse of Genesis to the last verse of Revelation in my 20s. And the translation I read was the New English Bible. And I've got a copy somewhere in the house, but I've actually misplaced it. And you actually can't buy it now, but what you can buy is the Revised English Bible, which was published in '89, and it's actually worth reading. I mean, I know people get put off by it because it looks so big and it looks so boring. When you actually start reading it, it comes to life. And I recommend reading the Bible whether you're a Christian or a Muslim or an atheist, because it's one of the two most important books of human history alongside the Quran. This book by Robin Lane Fox is extremely readable. It's an academic discussion of the history of the Bible and where it came from. And as I said, academics have God out of scope. So you won't find an explanation saying God wrote the Bible, but it's a fascinating book, very easy to read, strongly recommend it. The Quran, if you've not read the Quran in English before, the translation to read is this one by Abdul Halim, published in 2006. Very easy to read, designed for new readers, hardly any footnotes. If you're interested in serious study, the Study Quran, which came out only 5 or 6 years ago, is immensely detailed, very well footnoted, but please don't start there first. If you want to encounter the Quran, start with the Halim translation. For the history of Islam, Tom Holland's book, In the Shadow of the Sword, is unputdownable. He's a brilliant historian, writes really well. The first half of this book is nothing to do with Islam. It's about the Eastern Roman Empire. And although I did Latin at school, and I knew a lot about the history of ancient Rome and the Kingdom of Rome and then the emperors and the Republic in between, I learned an enormous amount because my old teaching all stopped about 100 AD. And this tells you about the history of ancient Rome, particularly Byzantium, all the way up to the time of the rise of Islam, and then the rise of Islam itself. You can't stop reading it. It's really strongly recommended. There's a review on my website. And then this book about Islam, the reason I recommend this book is that it's not by a Muslim. Hans Kung I think he's now died, was one of the world's leading Roman Catholic theologians. And he wrote this 700-page book about Islam from a Roman Catholic perspective, and it's really illuminating. And when a Muslim says nice things about Islam, you'd expect that. But when a Roman Catholic says nice things about Islam, it's because he's really sincere and he means it. And then this is about Jesus, but Jesus from a Muslim perspective. Again, this book only came out a few years ago, very easy to read, not very long. And it sees Jesus as a human being and what Islam says about Jesus. So that's everything that I wanted to cover. Now it's over to you.